They dragged him through the mud, nails torn, flesh ripped. A crown weighed heavy on a bleeding head. England watched in stunned silence. Who was this man draped in royal purple, yet treated like a common criminal? Why did they fear him? Why did they strip him naked at Tyburn, then bind his limbs to 4 horses ready to tear him apart? This was no accident of war, no battlefield retribution. This was justice, so they said, for treason. His name had once inspired loyalty. He had once stood in the throne's shadow, whispering counsel. But now, as he writhed on wooden beams, they fed his screams to the crowds. Each gasp, each crack of bone echoed through London's streets. The air tasted of fear and fascination. One by one they came to stare. Historians call him the first official traitor, a title that drips with irony. How does a prince become a monster? How does loyalty flip to betrayal? How far will a kingdom go to make an example of its own? Brace yourself. This story is unlike anything you've heard. England in the late 1280s was a kingdom perched on the edge of transformation and turmoil. King Edward III, nicknamed Longshanks for his towering frame, had just returned from campaigns in Gascony and was turning his sights northward. Behind the stone walls of castles and the flickering torches of great halls, the old order trembled. Feudal loyalties, once unshakable, were being tested by ambitious monarchs and proud regional lords. The laws of inheritance and allegiance that had bound warrior and vassal for generations were splintering under the weight of a king determined to assert his authority. It was within this atmosphere of grudging oaths and uneasy truces that Dafydd ap Gruffudd came of age. Born sometime around 1238, Dafydd was the youngest son of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn and a grandson of Llywelyn the Great, the prince who for decades had ruled a disparate Wales from the rolling hills of Snowdonia to the wide plains of Gwynedd. Yet Dafydd's upbringing was overshadowed by the uneasy peace his uncle Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, also known as Llywelyn the Last, had forged with the English crown. Those years of truce masked a tension as brittle as a frozen river, promising that at the first heat of ambition or insult, the ice would crack. In the courts of his family's ancestral seat, Dafydd was schooled in both swordplay and the intricacies of medieval politics. He learned how to navigate the tangled web of customary Welsh law, where land disputes could flare into feuds lasting generations, and the demands of the English feudal system, which placed him in theory under the protection and command of Edward himself. He was a prince, yet in Edward's eyes, merely a marcher lord whose lands lay along the volatile border between two proud peoples. Around the 1265, during the Second Barons' War in England, Dafydd's loyalties first wavered. He briefly supported Simon de Montfort's rebellion against Henry III, only to watch that cause collapse at Lewes and Evesham. By the time his brother Llywelyn sat down with Edward to ratify the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, granting the Welsh prince recognition of his authority, Dafydd had already tasted both the camaraderie of rebellion and the humiliations of defeat. He stood at the crossroads of two worlds, belonging fully to neither. As Edward I ascended the throne in 1272, he viewed the stronghold of Welsh autonomy with a mixture of impatience and intent. Richard Earl of Cornwall had brokered deals, but it was Edward who demanded outright submission or outright conquest. In 1277, he swept into Caernarfon with a sizable army, forcing Llywelyn to sue for peace. Dafydd, seeing his brother humiliated, grew restless. In a gamble that would mark him forever, he switched allegiance, first pledging fealty to Edward, then reneging and joining his family's resistance in 1282. This revolt was not merely a skirmish of border raiders, but a desperate bid to preserve a fading way of life. In the bracing cold of early spring, arrows darkened the sky around Flint and Built Wells. Castles changed hands as clansmen answered the cry for freedom. Dafydd, once content to play courtier and warrior, by turns now found himself the architect of daring raids and nighttime ambushes that shattered the uneasy calm. Yet for every advantage he gained, Edward pressed back with iron discipline and siege engines that reduced stone fortresses to rubble. The English king's strategy was methodical: isolate the rebel prince, cut off his supplies, and demonstrate that no mountain refuge could defy royal might forever. By the summer of 1283, Llywelyn lay dead at the slopes of Builth, felled in battle, and left unburied as a warning. Dafydd, his last ally and bloodkin, surrendered in late June at Hawarden Castle. He had seen the writing on the wall: the tide of power was turning, but he may never have imagined the price he would pay, not just death, but a spectacle of brutality that had until then been reserved for the basest felons. As he was led away in chains, the echoes of church bells and the murmur of crowds framed the final chapter of his life. Somewhere between the tolling bells and the cold stone of Westminster, Dafydd must have understood that this moment was unlike any his family had faced in centuries. Ahead lay Tyburn, the gallows by the Thames, where his fate would be sealed in a manner so savage that it would reverberate through history itself, a grim testament to the lengths a kingdom would go to punish betrayal. The first spark of doom struck one crisp dawn in early spring, when scouts riding north of Aberystwyth brought word that King Edward's banners were marching through the valleys. Dafydd rose before dawn, the embers of his hearth guttering as he laced his boots. He had spent months preparing loyal Welshmen for this moment, training in hidden glades, stockpiling arrows behind crumbling walls, and forging alliances among disenchanted lords. Yet even as he let the chill wind bite his face, doubt shadowed his mind. Would his people rally for one more fight, or would fear break their resolve? Word reached him that Edward's army, numbering in the tens of thousands, had split into columns to sweep the terrain. One column, led by the redoubtable Earl Warenne, was heading straight for Castle Eger Dafydd's stronghold, where aged families sheltered their flocks and stored their grain. The prince galloped across stony ground, his horse's breath steaming in the cold to warn his garrison. He found them hammering stout oak gates, shut children clutching knives, and old men praying for reprieve. His voice, firm but edged with urgency, carried through the courtyard. They come at midday. You know this land better than their knights. Use the hidden paths, strike swiftly, then vanish like mist. That afternoon, the thunder of hooves echoed against mountain walls. English knights, clad in steel plate, advanced in disciplined ranks, banner on banner snapping in the wind. Dafydd watched from a rocky crest as the first volley of Welsh longbows found their mark. Shields shattered, faces grimaced, horses reared, but Edward's men pressed on sheaths of arrows arcing overhead like black rain. Stones tumbled, gates splintered, and soon the attackers were inside. The Welsh slipped away into forests, abandoning homesteads to flames. From his vantage, Dafydd saw smoke rise red against pale sky. Every charred beam, every fallen comrade stoked his anger into a cold determination. Back at court, Edward received word of the raids, with controlled fury. He laid down his quill, the ink pool trembling at the edge of the parchment. Dafydd ap Gruffudd, he wrote, has broken his oath and shed Christian blood. He is a traitor, stripped of all mercy. The words were joined by a royal decree. Any Welshman harboring the prince would forfeit land and title. Any captured alive would kneel in chains before the king. Across England and Wales, townsmen read these proclamations, tacked to church doors, their breath catching as they contemplated harboring a doomed rebel. But Dafydd, unbowed, found refuge among clans in Snowdonia. Their granite peaks rose like silent sentinels, hiding narrow passes where English cavalry dared not follow. There by torchlight in a cave, deep on Moel Siabod, he plotted his next moves. Flames danced on mossy walls as he paced before a ragged council of captains. Some urged a daring strike on Caernarfon Castle to inspire fear in Edward's heart. Others counseled caution, wait for winter when supply lines frayed and men grew thin with hunger. Dafydd's gaze flicked from the eager to the fearful, weighing loyalty against practicality. Finally he spoke with the calm of steel. We fight not for glory, but for our birthright. We must choose audacity over delay. Tonight, under the moon's pale eye, a company will ride to Harlech and seize its towers. That night, under a sky unlit by stars, Dafydd and 50 men crept across marshy ground faces blackened with clay. The castle's walls loomed like a sleeping giant. A sentry's torch swept the battlements. His shovel dug deep into the earth. Dafydd signaled. The wind caught the torchlight as they slipped inside, blade ready. A whispered cry, then silence. Oil lanterns broke into shards. The garrison, stunned, fled through winding staircases. Within hours, the Earl's retinue was hunting ghosts. Word of Harlech's fall raced to Edward another blow, another humiliation. But every triumph carried a cost. When Dafydd returned to Snowdonia, he found the village of Llanberis reduced to rubble. English firemen had torched farms in reprisal. He saw widows wail over charred cradles, children clutching singed blankets, barns smoldering into ash. His own heart felt torn, as surely as a beast's flesh. Rage swelled, but guilt pounded against it. Did his victories feed this horror? He wondered as he cradled a weeping mother, whether honor had any meaning when the innocent suffered in his name. The weight of command pressed upon him more heavily than plate armor. Meanwhile, Edward marshaled fresh forces, mercenaries from Flanders, crossbowmen from Gascony, and archers from the Midlands. Each force added to the might poised against the prince. Rumors spread of siege engines carved from oak, of iron-tipped bolts to punch through curtain walls. At court, nobles whispered that the king's patience wore thin. Some feared Edward might unleash horrors beyond conventional warfare. A hush fell over markets as merchants paused in their haggling. Welsh refugees in Chester prayed for safety, never suspecting a worse fate lay ahead. When the king finally moved, the campaign took on the precision of a chess master's closing strategy. He advanced from North Wales, capturing post after post, sealing roads and starving out strongholds. He sent emissaries to Dafydd with ultimatums: come in peace, swear fealty, and your lands will remain. The prince, battered and cornered, seized a lull in winter's grip to parley near Denby. He rode into a whitewashed hall, the walls thick with frost. Across the table sat Edward's envoy, parchment unrolled, quill poised. Dafydd's throat tightened. Did he believe their promises, or did he smell a trap? He chose caution, retreating before the ink could dry. The envoy's face darkened. The hall's torches flickered with warning. No more parleys would be offered. The war, they said, would end in blood or surrender. Back in his mountain hideout, Dafydd watched winter's sun slip behind frosted peaks. Morale was fraying. Some captains spoke openly of escape flee to Ireland, join other exiles, abandon Wales to its fate. Others, hardened by hardship, yet declared they would fight to the death. Dafydd stood before them one night, his voice low and fierce. I will not see our land shamed by surrender. Come what may, we will fight for our names, our children, and the memories of our fathers. Yet as snow blanketed the valleys, hope grew thin. Supply wagons foundered in drifts. Men's faces grew sallow lips, cracking in the cold. Anxiety gnawed at every heart. Spies whispered of betrayal of lords in the south, ready to sell their kin for safety. Family feuds resurfaced, old claims flaring into new grudges. In the dark of his tent, Dafydd wrestled with the isolation of command. His reflection in a tarnished bronze mirror showed gaunt cheeks and eyes rimmed with weariness. He began to question whether the spark that had fired his rebellion was truly courage or a desperate defiance doomed to consume them all. On a bleak morning in February 1283, English patrols closed in on his last redoubt near Hawarden. A scouting party stumbled upon his camp as dawn painted the sky in bruised purples. There was no grand battle, no glorious stand. Disbelief froze his men as wolves would prey on lambs caught in a frozen field. Dafydd's captains laid down arms, their hope extinguished by daylight and numbers. He dismounted, hands bound by iron, and met the stare of his captor, a grim-faced knight who spat, "You are the prince who flew too close to the sun." As they led him away, the full weight of his choices crushed him. He had set out to defend his heritage, to challenge a king's ambition. Instead, he found himself a pawn in a larger game, a symbol of defiance, yes, but also of failure. His head bowed not in submission, but in the resignation that comes when a man knows his story has reached its darkest turning. The road to London awaited every mile, echoing with the ghosts of those he had led and lost. And so, with chains rattling at his wrists and the horizon closing in, Dafydd ap Gruffudd entered the final act of his saga, a march from hope to despair, from prince to prisoner, from the frozen uplands of Wales to the scaffold at Tyburn, where the kingdom would deliver its most brutal verdict yet. They arrived in London as dawn was breaking the sky, a wash of pale gray and bruised pink, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to witness what was to come. Dafydd ap Gruffudd walked between two rows of soldiers, his ankles bound by iron fetters that bit into bruised skin. Each clank of metal on cobblestone sounded like a final verdict echoing through the streets. Londoners lined the way, merchants unlocking shutters, servants carrying pails of water, children peering wide-eyed from behind merchants' carts. Some spat, others crossed themselves. Many simply stared, mouths agape, as if hoping the spectacle might vanish if they looked away. He was led into Westminster Hall, its vaulted beams dark with centuries of judgment. Torches flickered along stone walls, casting quivering shadows that looked like prisoners themselves. The hall smelled of damp stone and old blood. Guards thrust him onto a rough-hewn bench. Chains rattled as he settled the cold iron, 1,000 pinpricks against his bare ankles. Across from him, a tribunal of robed judges sat beneath the painted banners of England's lions. Their eyes were formalities. He had long since been sentenced in the court of public opinion. A clerk intoned the charges treason rebellion, murdering the king's men defiling God's peace. Dafydd's pulse pounded in his ears. The words washed over him like acid rain, burning away any last illusions of mercy. When the judges pronounced the death sentence, hanged, drawn, and quartered, their voices were steady, devoid of emotion. The phrase lay in the air like a curse. He had heard of this punishment before, a fate so horrific that its mere mention silenced entire villages. But never had he imagined it could be delivered to one with royal blood, one born to saddle and spear, to counsel and command. In that instant, the truth settled in him. Loyalty and lineage counted for nothing when weighed against the king's wrath. They dragged him from the hall, past courtiers who muttered in their embroidered cloaks, their gazes flitting from his stained tunic to the banners overhead. Outside, a carriage awaited that gawky coffin-like box on wheels that would bear him to Tyburn. His hands were bound behind his back wrists, chafed raw by rough rope. His tunic was torn open, leaving his chest exposed to the chill. A coarse wheel of wood scraped across the stones, rattling his bones as he was lifted onto it. He tried to steady himself, but the motion made him vomit bile, burning his throat. A guard spat at him, "Save your strength for the gallows, traitor." The journey to Tyburn, a triangular green at the edge of the city, was agony measured in inches. Each jolt of the carriage tore fresh pains through his already broken shoulders. The crowd thickened as they approached farmers in woolen cloaks, noblemen on prancing steeds, friars clutching rosaries. Women wept openly, men fell silent. Even crows in the nearby trees seemed to quiet their cawing. At the gates of the execution ground, the scene spread before him, wooden scaffolds, iron hooks, glinting like cruel teeth ropes, coiled like serpents at the ready. They forced him down onto a low trestle, the rough wood splintering his palms as he caught himself. A knot of executioners gathered a hulking man with a blood-stained tabard, a thin-faced assistant who trembled as he fumbled with hooks, and a third whose eyes were empty hollows. A hood was pulled over Dafydd's head, darkness so complete it felt as though his nerves sparked outward, searching for light. The executioner's voice was muffled, but clear enough. "Prince Dafydd ap Gruffudd, for your crimes. The king's justice demands that you be hanged until you are near death, then disemboweled and emasculated, while alive your entrails burned before your eyes, beheaded, and your body divided into 4 parts. The words struck him like a blow. He could feel the breath of the crowd, the expectation that this was justice served. But terror rose in his gut, a cold, exquisite terror that burned hotter than any fever. They bound his hands behind the beam and placed a noose around his neck, the coarse rope rasping across his hairline. Someone whispered a prayer. A bell tolled once, twice, 3 times. His chest constricted as he tried to ground himself in memory, the laughter of his brother Llewellyn, the dawn rides through dewy fields, his mother's lullabies on stormy nights. Now all of that lay beyond a veil of fear. A stepladder was drawn away. The executioner's boot nudged the trestle, it toppled, and Dafydd dropped into the noose. His body jerked as the rope strained under his weight. For a moment, he hung beneath the gray sky, the air rushing past his face like a living thing. The world spun. Then slowly his feet scraped the ground, the noose choking off his speech. Every breath became a jagged fight against the rope, cutting into his throat. He saw the hands of the executioner raised, high axe gleaming like a sliver of moonlight. A foot kicked against his feet, removing the last support. He was suspended there, mind slipping toward darkness. Pain exploded behind his eyes. His hands clawed at the beam fingers, groping for anything solid. His heart pounded so fiercely he felt he might burst. Then, with a sudden jerk, the executioner yanked him upward, tightening the noose, pulling him closer to death's door. He convulsed limbs, shaking breath a wet rasp. The crowd's hush felt like a living shroud pressing in around him. Then came the strangest calm. As life ebbed, the muffled roar of his own blood in his ears became a distant drum. He saw the executioner step forward, axe raised. The hood came off, eyes opening wide. He saw the steel blade descend, heard the crack as his skull split. There was a last gasp, a wet, rattling cord, and then the world fractured into black. But death did not claim him that day. Instead, they dragged his body lower on the scaffold chest, heaving as if reluctant to surrender. The executioner cursed, lifting a dagger with a blade curved and gleaming. A thrust beneath the ribs, and he felt a searing heat as blade and intestines parted. He tasted iron on his tongue, his own blood, hot and sudden. The crowd winced, voices rising in a chorus of gasps and prayers for his soul. But they could not turn away. His entrails thumped onto the wooden planks, and the executioner held aloft the living, pulsing bundle before shoving it into a brazier to blaze. Dafydd's eyes flickered pain, searing every nerve. He could not scream, his throat already shredded. Each sliver of flame that licked at his flesh felt like betrayal by the sun itself. Time spasmed in him, seconds stretching like years as he fought the urge to collapse. Someone spit on him, someone else crossed themselves. The wind carried the crackle of burning flesh, a sound none would forget. When the brazier cooled, they seized what remained skin-blackened sinews, turned to ash, and chopped off his head with a single brutal stroke that almost fell short. Even maimed, his head remained defiantly noble eyes, half open, as if still seeking a final glimpse of the sky. The executioner held it aloft so the crowd could see the price of treason. Then they quartered his body, hacking his limbs apart with axes dull from overuse. Each blow sent tremors up the scaffold. His flesh yielded in wet, resisting chunks, and the crowd recoiled, some turning away, others craning closer. When it was done, 4 carts stood ready, each to bear a piece of his remains, to the corners of the realm, London, Northampton, Shrewsbury, and his beloved Snowdonia. This final humiliation proclaimed no corner of England or Wales could hide a traitor. As the carts rumbled away, rats darted onto the scaffold, scavenging what scraps the butchery had withheld. The air smelled of smoke iron, and something foul fear made manifest. Silence settled over Tyburn. A lone bell tolled in the distance. Some wept, some whispered prayers for his soul, others spat on the ground and walked away. No herald proclaimed a moment of triumph. The crown's statement was made in blood and flesh, not in words. And in that hush, the kingdom absorbed the lesson betrayal would be met with a cruelty that transcended justice, a spectacle to sear the memory of dissent into every heart. Yet in the darkest corners of the city, as moonlight slipped across silent streets, rumors began to whisper. They spoke of his courage in those final breaths, of a broken man who died defiantly, not begging for mercy, but staring at his tormentors with eyes aflame. They told of secret masses held for his soul, of Welsh exiles in ragged cloaks, marking his passing with quiet lanterns. And in remote hamlets beneath the mountains, parents pressed their children to ears and warned, "Remember Prince Dafydd. Remember what happens when a king's mercy runs dry. Remember that even a leader must bow before the iron will of a throne." So ended the life of the first official traitor in English history, a saga carved in agony and forever stained on the memory of two nations. The scaffold lay empty, splintered wood in a pool of dark, drying blood. But the story lived on in hushed taverns, in the margins of monks' chronicles, in the steady beat of Welsh drums calling for vengeance and remembrance. His death was not the end of his tale, but the cruel prologue to legends that would grow like ivy across generations, binding the hearts of the betrayed to the promise of justice yet to come. As the embers of that terrible day cooled, England seemed to breathe again, though its breath was heavy with recollection. The quarters of Dafydd's body, once so feared, were nailed to gatehouses in London, Shrewsbury, Northampton, and Conwy, each fragment a grim proclamation of royal will. Yet instead of stamping out rebellion, these grisly trophies became silent martyrs. In the north, villagers whispered of the bloody prince whose flesh once drew arrows in his veins rather than steel. In markets and inns, travelers carried accounts of his final courage, how even as fire licked his entrails, he kept his eyes defiantly fixed on the sky. Monks in remote Welsh monasteries hurried to record his story in illuminated margins, rendering his shape roughly but reverently in red and black ink. Though official chronicles dutifully omitted any hint of sympathy glossing the event as deserved punishment, private letters between noble families betrayed a different tone: lamentation, outrage, and unspoken vow to remember. In the quiet nights that followed, the execution lamplight glimmered on furtive gatherings, in hidden chapels where candles burned in his honor, and prayers rose for his soul's journey beyond this world. Over time, the sharp edge of shock dulled into a deep ache, one that lingered across generations. Tales of Welsh uprisings took on his name as rallying cries. For Dafydd shouted men who knew not his face, but felt his spirit in their hearts. Ballads sprang up along winding roads, sung by bards with sorrowful lutes, each chorus echoing the image of the prince who faced terror itself and would not bow. Even Edward III, grown old and haunted by specters of conquest, found no solace in that victory. His campaigns in Scotland bore hints of the same restless resistance that Dafydd had once embodied. In England's great halls, the brutal execution was first spoken of with proud satisfaction, then with uneasy silence. Guards who had manhandled the prince confessed in muted moments that no amount of steel or logic could quiet a man's last gasp when the axe fell. Some officers petitioned for clemency in later trials, wary that excessive cruelty might breed more defiance than dread. Yet official policy held firm treason remained the blackest stain to be cleansed with fire and fear. Centuries later, historians would debate whether the spectacle achieved its intended purpose. Did the kingdom truly quell rebellion, or did it forge a myth that outlived every stone on the battlefield? In village squares, children once coaxed from mothers the tale of the quartered prince, their eyes wide at the horror, their hearts oddly warmed by a flicker of sympathy. Artists sketched his gaunt face, bound in iron writers dramatized his final words, though no record survives of what he uttered in those dying moments, granting him a voice denied in life. The legacy of Dafydd ap Gruffudd endures in more than memory alone. In modern Wales, stones mark places of resistance, and poets still invoke his name as emblem of unbowed spirit. His story is taught not as a cautionary fable, but as a testament to the complexity of loyalty and power. In the shadow of castles that once imprisoned him, students debate whether his rebellion was folly or righteousness, and tourists marvel at the uneven justice that condemned a prince to a peasant's end. What remains undeniable is that his death transcended the immediate politics of the 13th century and entered the realm of legend. The brutality that was meant to crush a people instead energized their identity. The scaffold at Tyburn, silent for ages, has become a symbol not just of royal authority, but of its limits of the flickering line between order and oppression. And though his body lay in scattered fragments, the idea of Dafydd ap Gruffudd remained whole, a kingless prince whose final act was not surrender but an unextinguished defiance that would echo through time. And if that tale chills even now, imagine what came next: a boy king whose own court would quake with betrayal and blood. If you thought this was the darkest hour in England's history, wait until you uncover the tragedy of Edward II. Don't forget to subscribe and click here to continue into the shadows of royal downfall.